Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. The unforeseen transformation. In the dim light of dawn, Gregor Samsa woke to a life unrecognizable. His room, once a familiar sanctuary, now seemed a foreign land, and his body, an unwieldy shell that once housed a diligent salesman, had betrayed him. The Samsa family's apartment, a modest dwelling in a bustling city, became a silent witness to the metamorphosis that not only changed Gregor's form but also unveiled the fragile threads holding his family together. The story unfolds with Gregor's desperate attempts to cling to normalcy, his limbs flailing against the smooth fabric of his bedsheet, a poignant reminder of his humanity slipping away. His sister Grit, the melody and the cacophony of his existence, initially dances around him with a mix of fear and care, her eyes brimming with unshed tears for the brother she once knew. Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, figures carved from the stone of societal expectations, find themselves at a crossroads between compassion and repulsion, their gazes flickering from Gregor's monstrous form to the empty seat at the head of the table where their son once sat. As the family grapples with the financial void left by Gregor's absence from work, the apartment shrinks under the weight of their newfound poverty, each room echoing with the whispers of their discontent. The introduction of boarders, strangers who fill the space with their presence and pockets with their coin, marks a shift in the Samsa household, a transition from private despair to public spectacle. Gregor's transformation, a grotesque mirror reflecting the family's internal decay, becomes the silent battleground for their conflicting emotions. The once nurturing home turns into a prison of expectations and disappointments, with Gregor's insect form scuttling in the shadows, a constant reminder of the change that cannot be undone. As the chapter closes, Gregor, hidden beneath the dust of neglect, contemplates the remnants of his past life. The question lingers in the air, heavy with the scent of lost dreams. Will the Samsa family ever see beyond the chitin to the soul that remains, or will Gregor's metamorphosis forever sever the ties of blood and love? The answer, as elusive as the flicker of understanding in Gret's eyes, hangs suspended, a hook baited for the reader's curiosity. The burden of care. The morning light crept into the Samsa household, casting long shadows across the living room, where Gregor, now a creature of many legs and a hard shell, lay hidden under a sheet. The family had grown accustomed to the sounds of his skittering across the floor, but the emotional weight of his transformation hung heavily in the air. In the kitchen, Grete, Gregor's sister, sliced an apple. "Gregor, it's me," she said softly as she entered his room. "I've brought you something." From the corner, Gregor watched her with multifaceted eyes. He wanted to speak, but all that came out was a hiss. Greet whispered, "I know you're still in there somewhere." Back in the living room, the father donned his uniform for the bank. The mother, her face pale, looked on. "We'll have to find cheaper lodgings," the father decided. "And Greet, you'll need to work more hours at the shop." Greet emerged from Gregor's room, her face drawn. "I heard you," she said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The family sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts, united in their resolve. Gregor, listening from his room, felt a wave of gratitude for their resilience. The facade crumbles. The Samsa household, once a haven of laughter and cheerful banter, now lay shrouded in a heavy silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of floorboards. At the dinner table, the family's conversation briefly touched upon Gregor, who remained unseen in his room. "Greet, did you remember to—" Mrs. Samsa began, but her voice trailed off, the question left unfinished. Mr. Samsa's frown deepened. "We cannot go on like this," he said quietly. Greet's response was sharp, her frustration evident. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked, her tone a mix of anger and despair. The next day, Greet's brisk movements and detached demeanor as she cleaned Gregor's room spoke volumes. I'm working all day, coming home to this, she murmured, her gaze carefully avoiding the corner where Gregor lay. The family's struggle persisted with demanding lodgers and a cleaning woman whose curiosity was tinged with disdain. The once caring family facade crumbled, revealing the stark reality of their situation. They were surviving, but the once vibrant presence of Gregor had become a mere shadow in their home. The Samsa family continued on, each member ensnared in their own world of worry and weariness. A shift in control. Greet stood at the threshold of Gregor's room, a plate of scraps in her hand. With a sigh, she nudged the door open with her foot and slid the plate across the floor. It clattered against the opposite wall, the sound echoing in the dimly lit room. "Here's your dinner, Gregor," she said, her voice flat. She didn't wait to see if the grotesque insect that was once her brother would eat. Gregor, hidden in the shadowy corner, watched the plate slide away from him. The food didn't appeal to him. Nothing did anymore. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, the sound of their voices drifted into Gregor's room. "We can't go on like this," Greet's voice cut through the air. Their mother coughed, a weak sound. "But he's still your brother, Greet," she whispered. "No, Mother," Greet replied firmly. "That thing is not our Gregor." Gregor's antennae twitched at her words. He had become a burden, an it that his family wanted to discard. The next day, the door to Gregor's room clicked shut, sealing him away from the world he once knew. He crawled to the center of his room, his many legs moving slowly. He lay there, motionless, as the reality of his existence settled upon him. Isolation and despair. In the dim light of dawn, Gregor Samsa awoke to the sound of his sister Great's hurried footsteps. The sight of the untouched bowl of food from the day before made his stomach churn, not from hunger, but from loneliness. As the day wore on, the Samsa household stirred to life, each member consumed by their own burdens. In the kitchen, the clatter of dishes and muffled conversations were a constant reminder to Gregor of the life that continued beyond his door. One evening, Gregor overheard his family's hushed tones. "We must think of ourselves now," the father's voice trembled. "But he is still our son," the mother replied softly. "Gregor would have left us by now," Greet interjected. Gregor recoiled at her words, retreating to the darkest corner of his room. Days turned to weeks, and the neglect only grew. The cleaning woman would fling the door open, toss in scraps, and leave without a word. Gregor's world had shrunk to these four walls, and his hope of reconciliation dimmed. Then came the night that would be his last. As the moon cast a pale light through the window, Gregor felt a calmness wash over him. With a final breath, he closed his eyes, surrendering to the quiet embrace of oblivion, finding peace in the release for himself and his family. The next morning, the Samsas awoke to a new day and perhaps a new beginning. The final reckoning. In the dimly lit room where the shadows seemed to creep and crawl, the Samsa family gathered for a meeting that felt as heavy as the air itself. The father, his face etched with lines of worry, broke the silence. "We can't go on like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The lodgers have left, and our hopes for a stable income with them." The mother, her hands trembling, nodded in agreement. "Our savings are nearly gone, and the jobs we have, they're not enough." Greet, once the compassionate sister, now stood with a resolve that seemed too mature for her years. "We cannot let this situation control us any longer," she declared, her eyes avoiding the small door that led to Gregor's room. "It's time we make a decision." The room fell silent, each member of the family lost in their own thoughts of the creature that lay just beyond the wall. The creature that was once their beloved Gregor. Finally, the father spoke up, his decision weighing on him. "We must let go of Gregor. He's no longer the son I raised, no longer the brother you cared for, Greet. He's become a burden." Greet's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Yes, Father. It's time we think of our own future." With heavy hearts, they agreed to move on from the tragedy that had befallen them. In the days that followed, the family worked together to reclaim their lives. They began to look forward to a time when the name Gregor Samsa would bring memories of happier days. The Samsas were starting anew, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they walked it together as a family. And somewhere it seemed as if Gregor was there, giving them his silent blessing to move on. The catalyst of change. The morning after Gregor's death, the Samsa household was unusually quiet. They spent the day in a state of collective introspection, the weight of the past slowly lifting from their shoulders. Each member of the family was lost in their own thoughts, contemplating the future and the changes it would bring. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the room, the Samsas felt a sense of hope. They had endured the unimaginable, and now, with the tragic chapter of Gregor's life behind them, they were ready to face a new day. Together they looked forward to the possibilities that lay ahead, embracing the promise of a fresh start. A new dawn. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the Samsa household. It was a new day, and with it came a sense of hope that had long been absent from the family's life. The apartment, once a place of despair, now reflected a quiet readiness as the family prepared to step out into the world again. Greet, who had grown into a confident young woman, looked at her parents with determination. "We can't change the past, but we can shape our future," she declared. The family gathered their belongings and stepped outside, locking the door behind them. They made their way to the tram station, where they boarded an electric tram heading towards the city center. The ride was quiet, each member lost in thought about the changes that lay ahead. As they passed familiar streets, they remained contemplative. Mrs. Samsa smiled faintly. "Perhaps in time, we might consider a new place to live. One that suits us better." Greet gazed out the window, her thoughts on her own future. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll find something perfect for all of us." The tram came to a stop and the family alighted, stepping into the bustling city. They walked side by side, a united front ready to reclaim their place in society. "Let's start with a stroll in the park," suggested Mrs. Samsa. "A bit of fresh air will do us good." They found a bench under a blooming cherry blossom tree and sat down, taking in the beauty of the day. It was here that they discussed their plans and the steps they would take to achieve them. "We've been through so much," Mr. Samsa said, taking his wife's hand. "But we're still here, together." Greet looked at her parents, her eyes filled with a quiet hope. "And we'll make it, no matter what comes our way." As the sun began to set, they returned to the tram, their hearts carrying the weight of their experiences, yet feeling a touch lighter than before. That night, as they sat around their old kitchen table, they shared a moment of silent solidarity. "To a new dawn," they whispered, their voices soft, but not without promise.